Alrighty guys, good morning and welcome back to another little video. Today we got a fun one that's actually really interesting because I think I may have gotten somebody into trouble. Today, we're going to be taking a look at this. This is a Machinist X58 War Wolf. Now, the War Wolf is a motherboard that has been pretty common in the marketplace recently. Primarily made by Machinist, because I think they're the only ones currently making X58 motherboards. But this one is kind of special. I say special because, well, this motherboard really shouldn't technically exist. And I learned so much about this motherboard while doing this video that, well, stay tuned till the end and you'll find out. So, the X58 War Wolf is a black and gray motherboard that is a standard MATX form factor, or I guess technically the Chinese standard MATX form factor. Bless you. It has one PCIe X16 slot, one PCIe X1 slot. It has a 5-phase power delivery system, dual-channel DDR3, supporting up to 32 gigs of DDR3 ECC registered memory. Pretty standard setup for a motherboard. But this one is special, because when you search X58 overclocking motherboards on AliExpress, this one is going to be one of the first ones to actually show up. The picture of this motherboard actually says directly on it, supports overclocking. Now, this is where things get interesting, because in my testing with this motherboard, I discovered that it's not exactly true. Technically it is true, but not exactly. But we'll get into that when we actually get into the testing phase. So, let's just take a look at the unboxing of the motherboard, and then let's hop into, well, the actual testing of it. In pretty standard Chinese fashion, this thing came in a gray, like, plastic sack, and the box was in perfect condition. By the way, I ordered this motherboard 12 days before it arrived. So, this motherboard came to me very, very quickly. Taking a look at the actual box itself, it has very fun gamer branding on it, saying player exclusive, go beyond a luxury motherboard. And for the most part, I actually agree with what this box has to say. As an X58 board, this thing is actually halfway decent. And we'll get into more of the nitty-gritty when we actually get into the testing. This motherboard talks about having high-quality components, having a good power delivery system, stable for gaming, as well as a gaming assistant, which I don't exactly know what that means, but hey, I digress. And pretty much all the features that you would expect from one of these cheap X58 motherboards. Moving on over to the actual unboxing of the motherboard. We get the standard supplies. You get a SATA cable, which is a SATA 2 cable. The mounting hardware to have the adapter mount to from LGA 1366 to an AM3 or AM4 style pin adapter, as well as the I/O shield. Everything came wrapped in an anti-static bag, and it had the pink protective foam on the bottom side of it, so it wasn't going to damage any of the pins or connectors on the bottom side of the motherboard. Which, everything here is just kind of standard unboxing fashion for a standard Chinese X58 motherboard. But I did notice something kind of interesting. There was a sticker on it stating that it was certified guaranteed brand new, which I thought that was kind of cool. So pulling the motherboard out of the sleeve, you can see that we have 4 SATA 2 ports sitting on the bottom of the motherboard. We have a South Bridge heatsink, as well as a North Bridge heatsink, which I guess you would obviously need. There is a PCIe X16 slot, a PCIe X1 slot. It has standard Realtek audio, from my understanding, as well as a 5-phase power delivery system, and dual-channel RAM supporting up to 32 gigs of DDR3. There are 2 fan headers on this motherboard, and overall the motherboard is really nothing special. But this is where things get interesting. Remember how I said that it theoretically should be able to overclock? Well, if you take off the Northbridge heatsink, which was only held on by clips and a thermal pad, not actually thermal paste, you'll find that the chipset underneath this Northbridge is actually an Intel 5520 chipset, not an X58 chipset. Now, the Intel 5520 chipset is, while not being a bad chipset for a board like this, actually doesn't support overclocking. I mean, yes, technically you can if you use something like Intel's Extreme Tuning utility, but as an Intel 5520 chipset, you're not going to be pushing up base clock. So that's where I got really curious, because supposedly, like I said, this motherboard can overclock using base clock. But this is where things get really interesting. So, just to go over the parts that I used for this testing, I used an X5677, an X5680, and a W3680. I used all three CPUs and got pretty much the exact same results, the biggest outlier being the W3680, which I will go over in more detail. For RAM, for the X56 series CPUs, I used my 32 gigabytes of DDR3 ECC registered memory from Apidia that ran at 1333 in dual channel. For graphics card, I used my R9 Fury X, and just to make sure that this whole thing was going to actually perform properly, I wanted to remove any possible thermals, so of course I water cooled it, because hey, that's me, and evidently I water cool everything nowadays. By the way, no matter how much B-roll you try and make of that computer, there's no way to make it not look ugly. By the way, I'm not exactly proud of the way this system came out, because I literally threw it together in about 20 minutes. So, yeah, don't hate on me too much for this one. Okay, so getting into the testing now, things got very interesting very quickly. So, the first CPU that I tested was the X5677. Now, the X5677 is a relatively good CPU with a relatively high base clock, meaning that it should have, in theory, overclocked quite well. And as I said, this motherboard should have an unlocked base clock. Now, the Intel chipset, 5520, should not allow for base clock overclocking. So I was wondering what kind of kajiggery did they have to do to actually get this working properly? Well, the thing is they didn't. When you adjust the base clock of this motherboard, which can't even adjust all that far, it takes the base clock, and yes, it does actually overclock the base clock. It technically does work, but it disables turbo. It literally turns off turbo. Now, how far was I able to push the base clock on this motherboard? A whopping +2. It goes from a 133 up to a 135, and then after that point it won't boot, period. Not to mention the fact there is not a clear CMOS button on this motherboard, so you have to literally pull out the graphics card and pull out the CMOS battery every single time you want to clear the CMOS. So, in my testing, I had actually discovered every time I had adjusted the base clock, the system was actually running significantly slower. I also had discovered that reaction time for the entire system had drastically been hindered due to overclocking base clock. The fastest this thing would run is when you wouldn't touch anything and it would just run base. And yeah, I could literally try to push this thing up to 136, which I could get to boot very seldomly, but it would take my X5680 to a Cinebench score of 570, compared to the 690 that it normally is, or I forget exactly what it normally is. But as all the testing on this motherboard went, the fastest this thing ran was at stock. And truthfully, that's probably the way you should have it running. But things got even more interesting when I brought up my W3680. So let's roll this clip, shall we? Okay, so I wanted to actually show you guys how kind of wonky this BIOS is. First of all, using a W3680 inside of this system has given me some of the weirdest results so far. So, as I'm not gonna start swapping CPUs again because that would just prolong this video even more. Effectively, when you change this multiplier right here, or when you change the base clock frequency, it actually stops your CPU from turboing properly, even though you do have turbo enabled down here. And as interesting as it is, when you adjust the multiplier, it does nothing.
So even if we were to adjust the multiplier, let's just say go up to 28. Oop, 28. Oh, it doesn't even want to do it there. Do it like that. Set it up to 28. And now we F10. And then start mashing delete to go back into the BIOS. We can see, just from right here, the speed of the CPU has not changed from its base clock. And if we go over to CPU config, yes, it says that it is sitting at 28, but the actual ratio value is what you're looking for, and that is still at 25. It will not let you change the actual ratio value. You can only change what the CMOS says that it should be, but the motherboard will not listen to what the CMOS actually has to say. So that's just one thing. And then when you adjust the BLCK, because this is an Intel 5520 chipset, this is not an X58 chipset, you start having essentially what is throttled performance, meaning that you will start degrading on performance the higher you bring this. And my motherboard was only able to make it to 135 having stable, or 136 completely unstable. So with that being said, you can't actually overclock with this board. Even going into Windows and using Intel's Extreme Tuning utility, you will be running into crashes. Now, I have spent the last 2 days pretty much exclusively working inside of this thing's BIOS, testing every single setting I could think of. And even though, yes, also, like we go over to chipset, you can see CPU voltage. This does not actually change the CPU voltage. The DRAM voltage does not change DRAM voltage. And the VIOH, or I cannot English today. VIOH voltage does not change anything as far as I can tell. So with that being said, there is no alterations really inside of this BIOS that matter at all. And when you're inside of Windows using something like Intel's Extreme Tuning utility, you can maybe say stable if you bring all of the multipliers up to 27, but that still doesn't cause your CPU to overclock. For some reason, either hardware or BIOS limitations keeps your CPU running at its base clock. So let me show you that. Okay, so now that we booted into Windows, I still have the multiplier set to, 28 inside of the BIOS. So if we come over here and open up CPU-Z and hardware info 64, this should, in theory, give us a good understanding of what our CPU is actually doing. Now, I also set the voltage to 1.45, and according to this, our voltage is not anywhere near that. By the way, like I said, I set in the BIOS this to be at 28, and the CPU-Z is only reading 27. If we look here, we can see that the base clock is slightly higher, as I set it to 135, but it isn't actually using the multiplier overclock that we set, but it did actually apply a base clock overclock. So let's pull up Cinebench R15 here and see what our system has to say, because I have a feeling. Let's open up hardware info, let's run that. Open it back up again. Let's see, what are we running at CPU-wise? We are running at 3.48. So we are properly turboing with a base clock of 139? That's different. I've never seen it do that before. Although, yet again, we're not actually going above our base clock when it comes to just normal frequency. Because if we were properly turboing here during this test, we should be hitting 3.5 to like 3.7 gigahertz. But we're not even getting close to that. Let's see, what does CPU-Z say? Yeah, we're only running at a 25 base clock, which means that it completely disables turbo when you adjust the base clock frequency. But then the moment we drop a load, then it starts actually allowing the system to properly turbo again. Yeah, so I guess if you adjust base clock, it doesn't take into account the multiplier at all. So I'm going to, let's see, we just got 758. Oh, no, I don't want to run that again. Cancel. Yes. Save your score. No. let's restart this and reset the base clock. Okay, so back into the BIOS here, you can see that we're still running only at base clock. CPU config, and still it's sitting at 28 with a CPU frequency of 133? What? We saw that go up to 139. I'm so confused. Okay, so I was not getting this kind of reaction with my X5677 and X5680. This does not read the way that I thought I left it. Okay, let's set this up to 135, the way I know it'll go, and then let's load back into Windows and see what happens. Okay, so I just got everything loaded back up. Whoop. So according to CPU Z, we're still not hitting that 28 multiplier, and our base clock is at 134.7. Before, when we were just at 133, our base clock was at 139. So let's just hit this thing with a load and see what comes up. Let's see, and our turbo frequency dropped. Now we're sitting at 3.367 gigahertz, according to both things. We're still at a 25 multiplier, not even going up to the 28, but our base clock frequency is now running slower than it was before. So, yeah, I think this is pretty, conclusive. There is something seriously screwy inside of this motherboard's BIOS that whenever you start trying to adjust the multiplier and the frequencies, that it starts getting very, very finicky and very, very unhappy. Now, when it comes to this motherboard, I've been testing it pretty much, like I said, for 2 days. And the best score that I got on Cinebench R15 was my X5680 at completely stock settings. And as you can see here, even with both things technically overclocked, we saw the lowest score that we've seen being still just above the i7-3770. So, no, this motherboard does not actually do legitimate overclocking. This motherboard, if anything, throttles your CPU whenever you try to do any kind of overclocking.
Alright guys, Cross here from a few days later. Now, I was not exactly content with the definitive statement of, well, this motherboard just doesn't overclock. I didn't feel like I did my due diligence, and I wanted to continue working with it. So now I'm on day number 6 or number 7 of specifically working with this computer right there. And I actually learned a little bit more in the process of doing this. Well, yes, you can actually get a little bit of an overclock. I don't really know how worth it actually is. Let me explain. Okay, hopping on over to 3D Mark, I just want to show you guys some of the results that I was getting that really are, I'm just going to put this bluntly, it's wonky. This was the best result that I got. I got a score of 12,561. And if we hop down here to processor specs, you can see that the processor was running at 3.9 gigahertz, which isn't a big boost over base clock, but it is a little bit of a boost. Now here's the problem. I don't know how I did this. I had set the motherboard back to stock, and it ran a base clock of 139. I have absolutely no idea why it, in this situation, ran a 139 and did not do that at all for any of the other scores. We hopped down one score. With a base clock of 135, I was able to get a score of 12,559. And as you can see, the CPU turboed all the way up to 3.776 gigahertz, which yet again is a little bit of an overclock, especially using a base clock, because the X5687 is a locked CPU. But as you can see by looking at the RAM frequency, yeah, there was a little bit of a base clock overclock. But here's the thing. this is what I got running 135 on the base clock. Let's just take any of these other results, and if you see that it's running at 3.772, 3.773, like any of these numbers, and I have absolutely no idea why all of these are still running at 3.7. So you know how the definition of insanity is doing things over and over again and expecting different results? Well, how about the definition of insanity is doing things differently each time and still getting the exact same results? A lot of these numbers, a lot of these 3.7 gigahertz, I was running at different base clock frequencies. I was resetting CMOS, I was going back to default, and it was still running at the same speed. And I'm not sure why this was happening. I'm not sure why on this one restart it was running at 139 instead of 135 or 133. It does not make sense to me how this was happening. But I can definitively say, yes, this motherboard actually did give me a little bit of a base clock overclock. But effectively, doing more due diligence, trying to understand the system a little bit better, it's just inconsistent. It is inconsistent and it is wonky, and I really don't know why or how it did what it did, but that's kind of where I'm sitting with this. Yes, I was able to get a little bit of an overclock, but it wasn't all that impactful, it wasn't all that much. And honestly, as much as I like this motherboard, it was just kind of inconsistent. So, conclusion for this wonky-donkey little motherboard. Honestly, I still like it. If I just made the decision to not try and mess with frequencies or multipliers or anything and just say, okay, this thing is now just a motherboard that is locked, it would still be a relatively decent motherboard, because some of the features that I didn't really even talk about on this thing, it's got actual PWM control for the CPU fan, it's got only one fan header that isn't the CPU fan, and that's just 3-pin. You can put up to 32 gigs of DDR3 in here. You can put in a locked CPU and have a relatively decent experience. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. When I was doing overclocking and testing on this motherboard for about 8 to 10 hours a day, this thing did not overheat. The North Bridge never got above about 75 degrees Celsius, and the North Bridges on these things can take up to typically about 80 to 90 degrees Celsius before you start running into problems. And yeah, I honestly, just using it as a motherboard, was quite content with its performance, on top of the fact that, well, yet again, it is rather cost-effective. Even though that this motherboard is kind of like one of the cheapest motherboards you can get on AliExpress for X58, it still did what it needed to do. But now let's get into the kind of more interesting bit that I kind of teased at the beginning of the video. So, before I did all my extra testing, I had actually contacted the seller, which is actually the machinist store. And I had said to them, did I receive a defective motherboard because I was having such inconsistent results and I was having really bad overclocking results? And their response to me was, dear friend, this motherboard does not support overclocking. May I remind you, the picture of this thing! And so, it was kind of making me wonder, like, should I actually go after these guys for trying to do, like, false advertising if they know themselves that these things are not exactly overclocking capable boards? Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think, because honestly, like I said, this is a halfway decent motherboard. The feature set on it is actually good. Yes, it can actually base clock overclock a tiny, tiny bit. Whether or not that it's actually important to you, I mean, that's kind of your decision. The color scheme of the board is great. The VRMs, run decently. The North Bridge doesn't overheat. Honestly, I could easily recommend someone drop an X5680 or an X5690 on this board. Drop in 32 gigs of RAM and just have a cheap little system. Granted, you're going for an X5690, you're probably not building a cheap system. Do like an X5680 and, yeah. On top of everything, it didn't have any problems. I didn't have any crashing unless I was pushing multipliers or voltages or not voltages, multipliers or base clock, and then it would crash. But beyond that, no, it was totally rock solid stable. So, yeah, I don't know. You guys tell me what you think about this thing, because I've been testing it now for about 6 days, which is why this video is taking so long. And I feel like I'm going insane, because I have tried so many different things. I've tried so many different things with this stupid motherboard, and I'm still just getting inconsistent or irregular results. I've tried 5 different CPUs now, and each CPU kind of acts in its own way. Now, I understand this is a cheap Chinese motherboard, and expecting perfect results out of it is absolutely ridiculous. It still doesn't change the fact that this thing is kind of weird. But, I digress. Alright, guys. I got a couple fun projects coming up, so stay tuned for that stuff, and I'll see y'all later. Peace!
Yeah, I got one brand on my diamond, yeah, bust. $250,000 my go yard though. I'm in the gas, so you still gotta show. Home with the drip and just learn how to hustle. Look at your bitch through these DR by folks, cause I get me some head, she been that shit over.